today we're going to talk about the product development process and the roles involved. Like this is going to be a whirlwind overview. There's a lot more details to it. So again, like ask questions. But first, let's tell a bit about myself before we get into it. I was a graduate of Middlebury in 2000 as a computer science major. Things were a little bit different then. When I was there, computer science was part of the math department. And my AI class was all about like tree searches. I don't know what folks learn now, but that was like A-star, min-max search, all that kind of stuff, if that sounds familiar to any of you. Fun fact is I actually did use that knowledge in an interview once. I had to remember from over 6 years before not thinking about it, and had to recite how that all worked in an interview, which was less than fun, but I did it. I did, after college, do software development for over 5 years at a company called TiVo that was like embedded Linux, C++ stuff. Then I decided to focus more on the business side of things. So I went to Goizueta Business School. After that, I had various roles, done product management. I've been a senior R&D leader in large companies, as well as the CTO of my own startup. So thrown some logos and pictures of stuff that I've worked on the slide here. My focus the last few years has mostly been on enterprise SaaS. I was recently working at Autodesk on construction software. So think of like folks using iPads on a building site to actually build the building. Currently, I'm working at a company called Wheel Health, where I run a team of PMs and engineers. We're building a marketplace-based telehealth platform, which happy to tell you more about if you're interested. So I guess summary is like I've run teams from like 5 people to 250 people. So I'm happy to share anything about my experience if folks are interested. All right. So before I get into roles and responsibilities first, the development lifecycle and the org structures, I want to make sure everyone understands one important thing. The software product to be successful takes a team working together. Like the best design code will not win because of its elegance. The best user interface will not win because it's so much easier to use than the competition, etc. Really, it's about how engineers, designers, product managers, marketing, sales, and more come together to build and then ultimately like message the product. So all those roles play key parts in the overall success of whatever you're working on. Also, just as a warning, I may have challenged myself to include appropriate cat gifs on every slide. So hopefully those keep you entertained. And if you don't like cat gifs, you probably should get up and leave at this point. All right, so there's a lot of roles involved in building software. I'm going to go through them pretty quickly and just do some highlights. So these are not like extensive descriptions of what they do. Again, happy to go into more details. So first off, let me focus on the roles within the R&D organization. At some companies also might be referred to as like the product organization. So it's interchangeable. Engineering, likely this is the main role that you'll think of when you think of software development. Like total count wise in an organization, like this is going to obviously be the largest. Typically, like you can think of like maybe 6 to 8 engineers on a development team. You've got 2 tracks here. You've got individual contributors or ICs and managers. Managers don't typically code, but are involved in like guiding teams like technical choices, like staff, principal, and architects. Those are very like senior individual contributors, and they're responsible for helping and guiding like designs of major pieces of the software platform. So they're kind of like the sages there that help everybody like in their thinking and so forth. Product management, each team should typically have a product manager. Only exception is for like very like low level technical teams. Those won't have them just because they're not necessary usually. But you can think of PMs as like the bridge or like the conductors. They bring together like customer needs, business requirements, like technical realities into like a thoughtful and prioritized plan. As a PM on a team, you don't have anybody reporting to you, but you need to get a group of folks on board with your plan. So like lots of responsibility with no like direct reports to just like, say you need to do this. So that takes a lot of skill, and it's not a job that I'd like recommend for everyone. Like many product managers do have technical backgrounds, but that's definitely not a requirement. Finally, since PMs are that bridge they also bridge to like the non-R&D parts of the company. They need to be able to take and like reframe what you're working on and like why it's important to different audiences. So think about like how like a person would talk to engineers versus like somebody in marketing versus support. Like that'll differ like based off like what they care about and what their motivations are. One thing I would say is that if this role sounds interesting to you, do not take it if you do not like talking to people. Like that will be a problem for you. Yeah, go for it.
On the PM front, just say a little bit more characteristically, attribute-wise, of someone who you think ends up being very successful in that role.
Yeah, it's a person that can is really good at building relationships and trust. Like that's the key. If you can do that and you're good at also kind of like I say owning a room, and being able to get folks to like understand, like deal with folks throwing challenges at you, like thinking quick on your feet, like those are the types of folks that really will thrive in that situation. If like you're not like don't like the idea that you're going to have to argue for your point of view or justify it, because people will push back, you'll get like engineers or sales folks that are pushing back on you. Like you need to be able to kind of handle that, because if not, it'll really eat away at you. So it's like for me, like for example, right, like I was an engineer and then went to business school and then did PM. Like I knew I couldn't be just an engineer long term because I actually frankly like to socialize and talk to other folks. And like a lot of engineers, or not that they don't like to do that, but like that's not like their main kind of way of working all day, right? PM, like you're running around talking to like pretty much everybody in the company.
So as a follow-up, if I'm an undergraduate student and I'm at a place that doesn't have a product management series of courses, how do I demonstrate those things?
Yeah, like so wanting to get into the role. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of things like you can talk about. Like I think somebody who's like, when you work on like group projects, right, in school, like that's a great example of where there's usually like the person or folks that help like kind of rally everybody together and get them working together. Like that's like what a PM does, right? You're taking together all these different folks and like helping to get them to like work in as one team. Like that's a key aspect of it. So I'd say like you could take some of the things. Great, my dog's here now. If my dog starts jumping up, you'll know. But you can think of that, those like apply those types of things that you've done in school, like those types of examples. I would say use them based and like relate them to what the role's about. But like most companies, if they're hiring folks right out of school, like they'll understand like that there's obviously going to be a lot of learning, but what they're looking for is like those core things that you can't really teach people, right? It's hard to learn, right, how to like rally folks. It's hard to learn how to like be that personal person, right, that you can really build those trusting relationships with. Like there's just some people that can do that really well and others that have a harder time with that. Like the skills of like the day-to-day stuff, like that can be taught. It's like those core bits that are hard to learn.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So on the design and research side, so think of these folks as like they take requirements and they create like the product experiences out of them. So it's a lot about like collecting feedback, coming up with like proposed designs, testing those designs, and like doing iterations on them. You also you often need to work like PMs in engineering to figure out like what's like possible given like resources, like time constraints, and business goals. So you can kind of come up with your ideal maybe scenario, but like the reality is like usually that's not possible. One comment that's really important, that if you take one thing from like talking about design folks, is there's a difference between calling someone like a UX designer and a UI designer. So be very careful, you can offend people. So like a UI or user interface designer, these are the folks that take something that's already designed and like make that like what that user interface looks like pixel perfect, right? So they're really focusing on the details of how it looks. A UX or user experience designer, they focus on the developing the overall workflow, and how a customer will like interact with it. So what I'd say typically most designers say are UX folks, not specific UI folks, but they do the UI work. So yeah, there are UI specific folks, but it's getting less typical. Pause here for a second to talk about like this tripod or trifecta. Like the product manager, the UX designer, and the engineering manager, like they're the core of this like development team. So like that's why I have this like tripod. Like you have to think about tripod. They have to be have equal standing in order to be balanced, and in order to also like really produce ultimately like the best solution for the given problem. So there's supporting each other, but they're also challenging each other, right? And that's how you ultimately come out with a solution that's better than like any one of them could come up with. So think about them like they have that ownership of what the team's doing, and like they're ultimately responsible for the success of failure of that team. Like it's if you find like product managers or engineering manager folks like pointing fingers at one another, like you've got a real problem with that team. And you really need to sort it out that they can't work together. It's going to affect everything they do and the engineers on it. So that's one thing I'd say is think about that, and they should really be in balance. Like no one more powerful than the other. So those are the three like those team roles, but there's a bunch of other roles that like make this organization successful. I think of these often they're in like a shared service model. So like meaning they're not directly associated with a team. They're like kind of they have their own like centralized teams, but they partner or kind of are like get associated with one of the product teams. Things are different though, and it could be different within even in a company how you organize yourself. So this is just for example. So just take that. So let's just take a look. First off, TPMs or technical program managers. They can make the difference between like a good and a great R&D organization, and their work really helps enable everyone to be successful. Like they can like really supercharge an org. When they're functioning at like the group team or group level, their focus is usually on like specific projects. So making sure like they're doing like tracking things correctly, like helping with coordination between like teams and groups. At an org level, they look more like the bigger picture processes. So think about like how an organization manages things like product planning, quality metrics, etc. So typically TPMs are very data driven, and like they're really good at showing like information in a consumable fashion to like tell you how you're doing or health of the org or health of the team, etc. And yeah, and like this GIF is definitely a very appropriate for them. Sometimes their roles really can feel like herding cats. So a data analyst or data scientist, I group these together, although like they're not necessarily part of the same team. But I think the thing to take away is that, today with products, there's like a ridiculous amount of data collected. It varies from like, things what you think of like of analytics of how like you're actually like using a product to like metrics on like the performance of web services that actually support those products, to like thinking about like an acquisition funnel of like trying to get a user to go from like acquisition to signing up to like paying for the product. The data analysts, like they typically help make sure like information is flowing from like various sources. Like you can have dozens and dozens of places where data is collected, or different services, excuse me. And they'll take that data and like standardize the formatting and then put it into a common location or like a data lake, which is just like a giant database. They also help with like more sophisticated analysis and dashboarding. Like a data scientist is a bit of a different role. They're using that data to help like actually solve, customer problems often. So typically you'll identify an area where you have a hypothesis that you can use data, like a data model or an algorithm to solve that problem. And then the data scientists will like look at the data that's available to them, like from the product or from like the industry or the world at large. And they'll then use that information to try to like build different types of prototypes to see if that actually works. Sometimes you get success, sometimes you don't. It's a lot of trial and error and then like iteration on those models or those algorithms in order to achieve your goals.
So Dave, you gave an example, you stated an example, object recognition. Can you give us like a real life example?
Yeah, yep. So a real life example, I'd say from the last place I worked, this is again like construction software. Like think about you've like kind of an idea of like blueprints, right? What those look like. And so these are getting digitized, and like how do you then take those and you want to like actually use those to digitize those blueprints, put them on an iPad, and then use them to like help track information and to help make decisions and like order quantities of materials, et cetera, et cetera. Oftentimes you need to understand like the size of a room, and you may or may not have like those dimensions built in. So like you can imagine it, yeah, you could do that by hand. You could sit there, you could like calibrate that sheet and see like, okay, yeah, the like, 1 inch equals 1 foot. And then you could draw on it and like draw these different, sides of the room and then calculate like length of the sides and area, and et cetera. Like huge pain in the butt. Imagine if you're doing that, for like a 50-story building. So what we were building was like an automated way to actually sit there analyze the blueprint, understand where the walls were, and then do a fill of actually figuring out where the room ended and began and ended. And then based on all that and automatically calibrating it, just magically coming up with like, okay, you need this much quantity of this much quantity of that. Yeah, so that process was a bit of several ways. Like we tried to do some training, meaning like throwing a bunch of designs at a model to train it to learn how to do that. That actually was pretty unsuccessful. Ultimately, the data scientists there, they used an algorithmic fill algorithm to figure out how to fill, like think about like pouring paint into the area and figuring out where the walls ended up.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. DevOps. So they're responsible for like infrastructure and process. So like think of like infrastructure as code. Like virtual, like you can think of like more specifically like like the virtual machines in a data center, right? And you need to get the code that some engineer wrote on their laptop. It's got to get they got to do their testing. It's got to go through a test suites, go to different like environments, whether that's like the test environment, like a pre-production environment to production. And then ultimately release. So they're helping to build and maintain all that. In some organizations, DevOps can also be responsible for like direct maintenance of like the servers, the services, and the database. Like I'm not a huge fan of that. I'm much more of a fan of like the DevOps team. They're building all the tooling that the teams use, but then the teams themselves have that ownership, and that's really important for like quality, like them owning their quality and the stability overall of their product entirely themselves. Like it just aligns that to their motivations. And then the last one from an R&D perspective are like the QA or the SDETs. So these are the quality gurus. They're not the folks that are solely responsible for quality, but they definitely set the tone. So each of these roles plays a very different but important part. So manual QA testers, like you can think of these are folks that like they're using the software, they're banging on it, and they're looking for like they're looking at the like screens, buttons, etc., and like how they come together. They're looking for like the problems in the seams. So you can have imagine like different teams have built different parts of a piece of software, and they all need to interact together into like a workflow. So they're looking to make sure that those actually are coming together as we expect. SDETs are really about building tools for teams. So think about like how you enable like end-to-end tests, unit tests, like API contract tests and stuff like that. So they're building all that infrastructure that then teams can take advantage of in order to make sure that their quality is what it needs to be. Okay, so that was R&D. Let me just highlight a few roles that are outside of R&D that I think are just important to note. So again, not an exhaustive list. So first off, and I think probably the biggest one to note is the product marketers. So this is usually a group within marketing, and they work with the product managers on public messaging and like internal sales training materials for all the features that are being released. So examples of like that would be like public blogs, presentations for pitching to customers, like a roadmap deck, for example, stuff like that. That's what the product marketers will help build. And they really do play an essential role in making sure the company understands like the why customers should care about what the R&D team has built. Customer success and operations. These folks are like are handling like the day-to-day interactions of what's happening. For B2B, they are especially a great way to learn about like trending issues and potential areas of focus for future development. So B2B, business to business software. They're also the ones that will report like critical bugs that customers like bump into in like your production software. So having a strong relationship with them is really important to be able to handle those situations well and then help manage the customer's expectations. And then the final one is sales. So as I said at the beginning, the best products don't always win. A great sales team can really make the difference. So as an R&D team member, it's really important making sure the sales team has a good understanding of like the strengths and the weaknesses of what you're building. R&D, works hard to build software and solutions that solve customer problems, and you need to make sure the sales team understands that and knows why they're important. Also, the sales team's a great source for like feedback of like what customers are actually excited about that you've already produced and where like maybe your product's not necessarily filling their needs and you're kind of failing or need to catch up from like a competition standpoint.
So who is the gatekeeper between the enablement team and the product?
What do you mean by the gatekeeper? Just I want to make sure I answer your question correctly.
Imagine in some organizations where the sales team, gets these great ideas for their customer, and they run to the engineering team and say, "We need this feature."
Yep.
I assume
that's a dangerous game to play. Frankly. There's so I'd say like number one, like it's really like ultimately it's the product managers that are making the calls on like what we're going to do and what we're not going to do, but it's up to like the leadership within the R&D organization to kind of help set, and we'll talk a little bit about the development process in a second, and maybe you'll see kind of how those types of things fit in. But if you're just sitting there playing like a reactive role to what sales happen to hear that day, like you're going to be like flip-flopping all over the place as you build out your product. And sometimes like you need to make quick decisions and implement something in order to get like a really important customer. But if you're doing that over and over and over again, like your product's going to be a hot mess, and you're not going to be building it for like long-term value. And eventually you're going to have to kind of like pay for that in many other ways, from like poor quality, like poor performance, and frankly even like attrition of the teams, because they're just going to feel like they're being thrashed back and forth.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So next let's talk about like what an organization may look like. This is just an example. So don't take this as how they all look like. So here, this is a bit of a lot, and I'll have a simpler picture in a second, but here you can kind of see how the reporting lines, that's why it's a little bit complicated. But we've got like 4 senior leaders here within like the R&D organization. So A through D, excuse me. You can imagine, like I would imagine, like if you want to think of like leader C and D, like think of them as like 2 distinct areas of product. So like, let's say like for, there's Google, there's like kind of the whole Google Docs, but like think one maybe owns like Google Slides, the other owns Google Sheets. So there's like a relationship between them, but they're different areas. So here the engineering product organizations both report up to those leaders. So that ensures like alignment between those different roles and the teams. Design in this case is actually a shared service. So you typically see that when you have like a smaller team. But again, like you can kind of see how they have associations with the different teams here. The benefit that this has when you have like a centralized team is that you get like natural sharing. So that helps like make sure there's like consistent approaches to how you do things, or how like in this case, like the user experience is built. There's of course other ways to deal with that if that wasn't the case. But the tricky thing is that sometimes like you'll have conflicting priorities between like the various like senior leaders and what the goals of the organization are in general. So that can be a little bit tricky in situations like this. But before I get into planning, like I just want to show you one other way that you could like look at this that maybe will help drive it home. So this is a bit of a simpler view. So this is like design, and now here is reporting up into like the same like leaders. So this is like I think the important thing here to take is like this can, hopefully you can see how you could scale an organization. Like you could imagine continue on with like more groups, to the right. And for example, like with this type of a structure, in my previous job at Autodesk, I was helping to manage a R&D organization of like nearly 900 people, and it looked pretty much like this. And you take these different like groups and you'd associate them together into kind of like super groups, or like centers of excellence is what we call them. The point being is like, if you have just like a few teams, like it's easy to like manage that. But like once you start getting to like half a dozen teams, like it can get really complicated if you don't like think through how your organization is planned out. And your structure needs to scale. Like that's the main point, right? So if you want to make sure that you can continue to allow your like groups and the teams to make decisions, and that you're not like bottlenecking every single decision like a single person or like a single leadership group, like that doesn't scale. And frankly, like the teams will get demotivated because they'll feel like they've lost control of their destiny. Questions on that? All right, so finally, let's get into a little bit talking about like planning and how like actual execution and like building software for the long term through iterative steps kind of works. Again, this is an example that, it's the way I've been working for the last few years. For a small startup, like this is way too complicated. But you wouldn't need all this. But here, like the goal of all this is to have enough process to like drive organizational alignment, but like not so much process that it feels like you're just having process because you want process. Again, not this is a specific approach. So there's many other ways that you could do it. All right. So this is the big one. Think about like the life cycle is like kind of 4 major stages. So you've got discovery, commit, execute, and manage. Some of these happen on like a regular intervals, excuse me. Others are activities that are just kind of constantly happening. And like the point here is it shows how to like really build long-term value, but also still being able to react to like immediate issues. And as we kind of like, Jeff, for your question earlier, like here the goal is to make sure that the R&D organization is proactive and not reactive. And the main thing to take tier 2 is like the information like flows or how things get refined goes from like left to right. So in the discovery phase, this is all about exploring and learning what problems exist and if they're urgent and important to tackle. Teams are always in this phase, like you're always learning information, getting input, and taking that input in. Discovery is done like you can think of like customer meetings, input from internal partners, like your research team, etc. Like there's numerous ways you can get that feedback. Ultimately, like here you come up with like taking all the input, you come up with like what I call like a deliverable candidate, or like kind of like a substantial piece of work that you want to put on your backlog. This is something that'll like make a real difference in the product. Then the commit phase, this is where you look like specifically at like the business needs and the product needs at a given point in time, and then make a decision on what you're going to actually build. Usually like you have a campaign, like a period associated with this, or like a campaign, and you have like a theme kind of associated with it. And like that theme is really how you align the R&D organization. So yeah, like think of it as like we're trying to like get into this new market, right? Of like companies this size, right? Like that could be the theme, or could be we're really focused on quality, could be a theme. Teams like will then, based on that, like they'll propose what they plan to do based on that theme, like what deliverables they think might be the good ones for that, and then they'll put that out there and get feedback from like leadership from like key stakeholders, and then ultimately like they'll take that and commit to what they're going to build. In the execute phase, like this is I think maybe where most folks like typically think of like teams and building. We just got, oh yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Just before you jump to execute, but one of the things I'm curious about is I understand that in the commit phase, folks are putting more definition around things.
Yeah.
What are the other drivers of a decision being made to go forward? Is it financial or is it something else?
It kind of depends, I think, a lot on the situation of like what the company's up to, like what's the state of your product. There's times where it's like, it could be like financially motivated in that you're trying to expand your reach of like what your addressable market is. And so you're adding on new functionality or extending functionality in order to make your product more appropriate for that particular market. It could be frankly like that, maybe like I mentioned, like you could be having like a lot of like stability problems or scaling problems, and like maybe you need to make sure your quality is there, right? It really kind of depends, and like that's like the point of having like that phase of like having that theme, putting out those proposals, and then getting the feedback from like key stakeholders, and we'll get a little bit more detail in a second to that, is to help make sure like that actually aligns with like what's best for for the company, right? So ultimately, it's like kind of what's most important to the company, or if it's like a large company, like that division in particular, right? And like what the overall goals are that you're trying to achieve, and like that's kind of how R&D then aligns itself to those ultimate like business goals. If you're not like aligned to that, then like you've got a real problem.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. So from execute, like this is where you think of like Scrum. If you've heard, like I'm sure folks have heard of Scrum when sprints, like that's where this happens. So you're taking the work and you're breaking down like to epics and stories. This is where like you're actually like the teams are building. And of course, like in this phase 2, you'll have like things like like beta, internal tests and stuff like that will go on here. And then ultimately you're pushing out, features and software. And then there's the manage phase, which is kind of like the last bit, right? So this really is about like, you got to take care of what you ship, right? You can't just like put it out there and ignore it. So yeah, you think of it like as like you'll allocate a certain amount of your like capacity of a team to handle that type of work. So it could be like making bug fixes on something that you shipped like years ago, or it could even be like something you just shipped last week. But the main thing here to think about, it's like it's ongoing. You're always got to like kind of maintain and take care of what you built. Okay, so let's just look kind of like how this all comes together, like of like bits coming together and getting more from like a funnel standpoint. And then or actually the teams can take all that input and then organize it into a plan. So first here, like you can imagine like having like hundreds of like feature requests or ideas coming in. So imagine like teams are constantly evaluating these things, organizing them together into deliverables, like that logical grouping that will deliver value. And then teams then like they take those, they create them, then they refine them over time. So that might have like, you could imagine like having some idea that might get passed over to like research. The research folks might like take some ideas, talk to some more customers, like you refine the deliverable and so forth over time, getting it ready to kind of be in a place where you could actually take it on. Next, the team, when you get into like the campaign, like that campaign window or that commit phase, you're looking at deliverables and proposing ones that they believe are the most important to consider based on the focus. Ultimately, like you're not going to commit to everything that you propose. You're using that period, like I said, to get feedback from within R&D as well as key stakeholders within the company. And I kind of also, as I was like getting to a little bit earlier, like some of those too can be purely technical in nature. So they don't always have to be something maybe that like ultimately you'll see from like an end user perspective. But they all need to be like I would say like urgent and important are the two things to like think about. So once you get all that input, you develop your plan for that campaign, and then ultimately like really it's the team that's going to make the call of what they're going to commit to. And that commitment is something that you believe they can like address the most important and urgent issues at the time, but you may not necessarily get to all of them. Like it's definitely possible that you'll commit to 10 and not necessarily get to them all. So finally, like getting into like the execute and manage phase, like so you build out that plan to deliver, and then like fidelity wise, like think about like when you're committing to it, you're going to schedule it out like kind of like on a month by month basis. You may have like internally like more of an idea of when you think it'll hit, but usually like that detail gets flushed out as you actually start building, understanding, and getting there's more fidelity there. And then along the way too, like you see the like kind of red, yellow, green dots there. Like you'll give status like updates and tracking on deliverables. So like you think of like on track, like at risk, or like blocked or descoped. So again, it's like a little bit of like you're committing to like what you believe you can get done, but those commitments like may or may not happen or achievable based off of like what actually happens when you're building it, or if something comes up of like a new information that you learn, you may choose to deprioritize something and prioritize something else if necessary, in order to like say win over a customer or deal with a quality problem. Any questions about how that all kind of comes together? All right, and then the last bit finally, this is something probably is familiar to you. If not, we can talk about a little bit more. This is a picture I just took from what a Scrum process sprints look like. Actually, sorry, hold on. This is not quite right. There we go. That's better. So main point here is that, you still use sprints like Scrum, Agile, all that stuff is still there. But like you do need to take like a longer term view of like what you're going to be building. But this still like the process that you use, like the Scrum process still gives you that ability to be flexible. Also here, once you take like in practice, usually the product manager plays that role, the product owner. There's like instances where that's not the case, but normally like it's the PM is the product owner. Engineering manager is often plays the role of the Scrum Master. But again, that can be different depending on the organization. So like, for example, I've been in places where like the TPMs are the Scrum Masters. So it just kind of depends on your organization, how it's structured. Cool. Yeah, so that's the quick overview of the process. Definitely happy to answer any questions. I also put my email address up there so you can reach out to me afterwards if that's helpful too. And yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks, Jeff, for inviting me to do this.
Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit more about the Scrum process, because I'm not that familiar with it?
Yeah, like I mean, here, let's jump back. Yeah, so like this is like how you're like executing like really on a week to week basis. So for example, where I currently am, the teams work in 2 week sprints. So at the beginning of every sprint, like they'll have this backlog of work. And then really just like these tickets of work like individual engineers can do, and they refine that down to a list that they're going to propose, like that's coming, like that'll come up for this next sprint. The teams meet together, they prioritize that, and then they start actually getting folks like committed to it. And like based off of this idea of like, okay, like you size those stories, you figure out how much you think your capacity of the team can take, and then like you commit to those as part of that sprint to get them done. And you work in that like a 2 week period. And after the 2 weeks, you see what, hopefully you get most of it done. You do like retrospective to make sure, like to improve the process, and so on and so forth. But like every 2 weeks, basically the point is you're taking in new stuff, working on it, and like outputting it. And after every 2 weeks, and like really in theory, like you're supposed to have like things that are ready that like that have provided some value. Like it might be like value that you're building up in order to like achieve something bigger, or it could just be like you've shipped a new feature individually. If you're really interested in this, there's like ridiculous number of like YouTube videos and books and stuff like that that you could look at. But like pretty much any team that you would work on like is going to use like Agile Scrum to some shape or form.
Now, if you aren't getting the results you expect, what are some of the symptoms of that outcome?
Yeah, like so, I mean, the team's not like not producing, like they're committing to stuff and they're not actually getting it done in the sprint. Yeah, there's a few things. Like I think number one, the team just could be like doing a really bad job of scoping out their work and not like doing like kind of the like putting in the elbow grease, if you will, at the beginning of the process. So they're kind of like more or less like randomly throwing a bunch of stuff up on the wall and hoping, like hope as a strategy, which is never a good way to function. So that's really a problem. Like you really do need to understand like what your team's capable of producing in like a given time period. It's not going to always be exact, like stuff happens, but like you should have a pretty good understanding of that. So that's one thing that is typical. So like kind of like the overcommit. The other thing too is just like what not taking into account like kind of the day-to-day of like reality of work, meaning folks have meetings, like bugs happen, customer escalations happen, like stuff like that happens, and you need to allocate time to deal with that. So if you're just taking this very idealistic, yeah, maybe like it's realistic what you could get done, but you're taking an idealistic view of like how much people could actually work in a given like day or a week. Like that's also often a problem. Some people would call it like you see here, there's like a product backlog. I've heard people like refer to it as like a shadow backlog, where there's kind of this like hidden backlog of other tasks that people are up to that are also important, but just aren't being like put forth as what the team's actually working on. That's like also a common and real problem.
So when it comes to where the buck stops in terms of performance, who's responsible? Righting the ship if there's an issue.
Yeah, like so the team's not doing it, like an individual team. Yeah, I mean ultimately a lot of it's gonna fall onto the engineering manager, but also like the PM as well. Like again, like you can't really look at them in isolation. So somewhat the designer, but really those two roles in particular. Yeah, so I think mostly it'll be looked at like the engineering manager, or people will be like, what's up? Like, why is your team struggling? It could be, the situation, like maybe the PM's like not very good at like coming up with like working on the backlog and making sure that the tickets are clear what the engineers are supposed to do. So there's like a lot of, back and forth and wasting time and so forth. Like that could be like a problem as well. So ultimately you start like you'd first talk to the engineering manager, but then you'd really look at those three folks in particular and ask them, what's up. But yeah, it's often the engineering manager who takes the brunt of it.
So the question I have from an advancement standpoint, so thinking about career, right? Let's assume you got a team that's really working well, but well run, well greased, everything's working
Yep.
great. How do they advance in the organization?
Yeah. So I mean, like there's definitely like opportunities for whether it be PMs, engineering folks, or designers. Like you think of it like you usually have like a tree structure, like a root structure, right? So you have like teams, groups, like, and then like groups of groups. Yeah, so like that's typically how you'll move up from a management perspective. Like if you're doing a really good job managing your own team, like then the next step, for you would be like typically it's managing managers. You don't necessarily usually see like teams growing to like a really large size because it just doesn't work. Like you kind of have this like scale of like, if you think of a line of like efficiency, eventually like the more folks you add, like it gets overly complicated and you don't actually get like it's not like a linear line. Like the slope will kind of like slowly go down. So it's not like you grow the team and like you're like, okay, you're doing such a great job, Jeff, as being a manager. Like here's another 10 engineers to manage on your team. It's going to be like, you're doing such a great job, Jeff. Like we want you to go up to the group level, and you're going to like, we'll get a new manager for the team you're on, and you're going to manage like, like 3 or 4 other engineering managers and like own this whole entire, space and help drive that.
Cool, I like that. We have time for one more question. Go ahead.
This is kind of going back to the timeline of like the discovering, committing, executing, managing.
Mm-hmm.
But I was kind of curious, maybe you touched on it and I just missed it, but like where customer feedback would come into that timeline, and like where you think having and incorporating customer feedback is most important.
Yeah. Yep, totally. Yeah, if I brushed over that was definitely unintentional. But yeah, I mean, I think of it like, like all this intake, all this discovery, like that's like all customer feedback. Like ultimately, you have like internal folks that are making, like say like operations team may need, tooling changes and stuff like that. Like, but ultimately you're building it for customers. Like if you're not thinking and starting with like, what's the customer need? Like you've gone like way off track. So like, I think the thing to think about here, I guess, to maybe answer your question is like, if you think about like a salesperson coming back to you, kind of like Jeff's question, like sales is like saying, oh, we need X feature. Like, especially as a PM, like you should always like kind of like raise your eyebrow and be like, okay, like why do they want X feature? Because oftentimes like what the customer may ask for is not necessarily like the right way to approach the problem. Like you really want to make sure you get to the root of like what their need is and what their goal is, and figure out then the right approach to take to that. Because they could come up, and I've seen it many, many times when I've been in a meeting with a customer and they ask for something that frankly is like, that is the dumbest thing I've ever heard of. Like, of course you don't say that. You just think that in your head. But then you say, okay, like I hear you, like, can you explain to me more about like why you want to do that way? And it's not their fault, right? Like they only understand like product from their view of like what it does and what it's capable of. They have no idea like where you think it's going, or maybe some capabilities that they're not aware of. So it's really important to like, yes, like listen to that and take it to heart, but also really get to the ultimately it's like to the need behind it and not just take it at face value.
Okay, anything else? Well, Dave, thank you very much. We appreciate this tutelage on the product development process involved. I know I learned a lot. Hopefully everyone else did too.
Yep, no problem. Great to see everybody, and enjoy your weekend.
Yeah, you too.
All right, take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.